changed since I've changed a lot. The second half changed completely. It's beautiful. Thank you. I saw all our girls that skylight on Monday. So there's Jacqueline, Isabel, Annabelle, Paige, and Sarah. Sorry, it takes me saying I'm going to cook with nerves because I slept.
And then we will get to the book. A lot of you did when you purchased your ticket. Inhabiting, and do have copies out there to purchase. And then all the books have been pre-signed. If you want it personalized, right, where you can stay after. And she'll be sending personalized books on the table here. And then lastly, if you use virtually, you can purchase a copy of the sisters by clicking the link in the live stream description. Thank you. Okay, so what a joy and a pleasure it is to be so moved by fiction the way I was with your sisters. These characters felt raw and transcendent and so very human. And I fell in love with all the many ways they lost and found themselves in the wake of devastating loss. This book reminds us what fiction is capable of making us feel. It certainly made me feel absolutely everything. And I'm so grateful that we had Coco here with us tonight. So Coco Mellors worked in London and New York, where she received her MFA in fiction from New York University. Her debut novel, Cleopatra and Frankenstein, was a Sunday Times bestseller, has been translated into over 20 languages, and is currently being adapted for television. She lives with her husband and his son in New York. And Tess Benty joins Coco tonight. She's the author of the New York Times bestselling novel, Rabbit Hutch, which received the National Book Award for Fiction and has been translated into a dozen languages. She is currently a writer in residence at University. Her second novel, Honeydew, is forthcoming moving off. So without any further delay, please join me in welcoming Tess and Coco.
Hello everyone, thank you so much for being here. What a beautiful space. And my daddy is here all the way from London. Hi Dad.
It's so wonderful to see all these faces filling this space for Coco's magnificent book. It was such a joy to read this. I was actually in a writing group with Coco as she was in the first stage. Well, it was polished. She had a pretty polished first draft of it by the time I was reading it. But it was a delight to see how, what remained and what changed over time. That was about 2 years ago now. So it's such a marvelous achievement, and I just wanted to congratulate you first on writing this beautiful book. I think of this as a novel about devotion. I was thinking about different kinds of devotion. There's devotion, obviously this is a novel about sisters, 4 sisters who are very devoted to each other. And it's also a novel about devotion to substances, devotion to a specific calling. There are beautiful sections in this book about boxing. Some of my favorite scenes and some of my favorite passages of the writing were about Bonnie, one of the sisters, experienced boxing. She's a professional boxer. And it reminded me so much of this kind of relationship to writing, which I suppose probably informed some of that. And then it's also about, above all, it's a kind of about devotion, the demands of devotion, the kind of like thorns of devotion. And I was wondering, is this, how do you think of this book? How do you describe this book? And if you were, I assume a lot of people in here have copies of the book, but it was just published recently, so probably a lot of people are beginning to read it. Like, how would you describe it to somebody?
Yeah, I think that's such a lovely way of thinking about it. Obviously, we're in the perfect setting to be talking about devotion, but I love that idea of something that is both beautiful and ugly, that requires a lot of you in the best and worst way. And I think I was really interested in writing a story about siblinghood and sisterhood that captured the sort of messy viscosity of that love. I felt like my own relationship with my sister had been so central to my life, and the love I felt for her and feel towards her and from her is so unconditional. But I know it's unconditional because it's been tested under not ideal conditions. And I feel like my sister is sort of the one person on earth that I would die for, other than my son, but who I also want to kill, like really kill sometimes. And that, it's that combination of the sort of the dark and the light and the love and the hate and the longing for closeness and the fearing the closeness that I was trying to sort of grapple with in this novel. And exactly as you said, devotion is a beautiful thing. To have a calling is a beautiful thing in life, but it's also sometimes kind of a burden. And I think family which is the topic of this novel, family is at one point one of the sisters says it's the root of all comfort and all chaos. And that, I think, is what I'm always attracted to in terms of topics, things that contain these sort of equal extremes that don't cancel each other out, but somehow exist sort of within this friction together.
That makes sense to me, and I thought that some of the strongest depictions of sisterhood relied upon these depictions of cruelty, these depictions of these kinds of small betrayals, large betrayals. The scene I was going to ask you to read, although I'm not sure if we have time, is a fight scene. I just thought it was an incredibly rendered, it was funny, it was really heartbreaking. There were these like, I was raised with all brothers, and we just didn't really have these, where it was like, I don't know, people are really airing things, like airing grievances, long-term grievances, but also always kind of like the balance of tenderness is always really present in this book. But speaking of brothers, I was actually going to ask you a little bit, and then maybe we can do a little reading, is about the representations of femininity in this book, because it does seem to be a book to me about a kind of distinctly female experiences. I mean, there are really meaningful and poignant descriptions of endometriosis. There are descriptions of sexual violence and other forms of kind of violation that these sisters encounter in various, and especially I think the scene of the photographer with Lucky is one of the most powerful scenes. And I was thinking about how you contrast that by subverting expectations of what sisterhood and maybe femininity and womanhood look like on a day-to-day basis. These are sisters who are actually quite tough. They're very tough. Their exteriors are very hardened. They struggle to be vulnerable with each other. They struggle to communicate. I remember there's a scene where Bonnie is just like patting Lucky on the back at one point, kind of like a boxer would with like I don't know, a fellow boxer or something. After there's a lot of language around violence, around, at one point Lucky is with a girl who's obsessed with her, and the girl says, "You're worse than any boy." And I was just wondering how you were thinking about representing, as you're representing three women, how you were thinking about representing their experiences as women, and then also balancing that with subverting whatever readers are expecting of that.
I think a lot of that work ends up happening unconsciously as a novelist. So like when I sit down to write, I never think like I'm going to write a woman's story, you know, and like I want to write about the theme of addiction or the theme of femininity. But those themes are sort of always, they're like the river that's running beneath the work all the time. I always start first and foremost with character. Like I'm always just trying to write one individual at one moment in their life. And the more specific that is, somehow that taps into these universal themes. And it was interesting writing a book entirely in female perspectives. Cleopatra and Frankenstein, my first novel, is from 7 perspectives, and half of them are men in their 40s. I don't know why that was the space I was interested in occupying as I was a woman in my 20s, but it was really fascinating to write. And this book, I think I really did want it to like belong to the girls. And I felt like the choice, for example, for Nikki to have endometriosis, which is the sister who sadly has died, and the book opens on the 1-year anniversary of her death, I did have to think, like, what would she have died from? Like, I was thinking, technically, like, what would make for a compelling storyline? And I guess I just felt like I wanted it to be something that was an issue that affected women, and I wanted it to be something that is hard to talk about and isn't talked about enough. And I guess unconsciously, I'm constantly being drawn to write about what we have a hard time talking about. Like those seem to be the topics for me that have a vibrancy on the page, or they really excite me to grapple with, because I feel that there's a lot of questions within those topics that haven't been answered. And then when writing the sisters, like a character like Bonnie, who's a professional boxer, I loved the idea of writing a female character who, again, has those contradictions. Like, she's so strong and she's so defined by her physicality. I mean, like, being a boxer is, talk about devotion, like, it is the most grueling of any sport. And I trained with a boxing coach for 1.5 years in order to write her scenes, and like, it almost killed me. You know, I got a black eye, which I was very proud of, but I really wanted to write a female character who is in some ways defined by her body, but with tremendous agency and power in her body. It was phenomenally satisfying to write. And yet on the flip side, she's the gentlest of the sisters. She's like the diplomat in the family. She has this lovely, soft approach. She's very gracious in the way she lives. And I think, you know, I mean, it's the cliche, like, we contain multitudes, but we do. And I think, you know, a character is really alive on the page when they seem to contradict themselves. Like, for me, that's when I know that I've created someone who's living and breathing and real. And so to write women is always to include that in some way. You know, it's what you would expect of sort of womanhood, and then it's what you wouldn't expect. And both those things are important to sort of contribute to the narrative. Should I read a tiny bit?
Yeah, do you want to read? Okay.
Yes. I just want to read, this is my first time touring the book in the US. I won't read for too long because I know we don't have that much time, and I want to hear questions from all of you as well. But I'll just read the beginning of the prologue. A sister is not a friend. Who can explain the urge to take a relationship as primal and complex as a sibling and reduce it to something as replaceable, as banal as a friend? Yet this status is used again and again to connote the highest intimacy. My mother is my best friend. My husband is my best friend. No. True sisterhood, the kind where you grew fingernails in the same womb, were pushed screaming through identical birth canals, is not the same as friendship. You don't choose each other, and there's no furtive period of getting to know the other. You're part of each other, right from the start. Look at an umbilical cord, tough, sinuous, unlovely, yet essential, and compare it to a friendship bracelet of brightly woven thread. That is the difference between a sister and a friend. And then the prologue introduces each of the sisters one by one, blah, blah, blah. We do Avery, Bonnie, Nikki, and Lucky, and then I'll just read the final paragraph. When Lucky enters a room, it is like an electric eel slipping into a bowl of goldfish. She is sharp-witted and secretly shy. She taught herself to play the guitar while living in Tokyo, and is pretty good, but too self-conscious to ever perform in front of anyone. She still loves playing video games, loves any form of escape, in fact. Right now, she is living alone in Paris. She has said the words, "I need a drink," 132 times so far this year. That's more than she said, "I love you," in her entire life. In her apartment in Montmartre, she has the framed blue butterflies Nikki gave her before she died hanging above her bed, but she rarely sleeps. Lucky is 26 years old, and she is lost. In fact, all the remaining sisters are. But what they don't know is this: as long as you are alive, it is never too late to be found.
Thank you. One of the things that passage, this opening, makes me think of is how much hope I felt at the end of this book. This is a really life-affirming, life-giving book. And the moment I cried in this book was actually a moment of protection. I won't spoil this moment, but it's a moment of contrast. It's after the photographer scene, and a character comes to, and after this moment of extreme vulnerability and violation in a different timeline, in the present timeline, she comes to and she realizes this woman has been watching her as she's kind of been passed out and vulnerable at a bus stop in a city where she doesn't live. And the woman says, "I was watching you, I was protecting you, I would have woken you up before I got on the bus." And this moment of tenderness really made me cry. I was actually recalling it to my fiance, and I was crying again. I started thinking about it because, and I wanted to bring it up because it's so, that kind of contrast exists throughout the book. There's a lot of energy in the book generated by these contrasts between moments of extreme vulnerability or violation and moments of real tenderness and care. And it made me realize that all the tenderness and care, why I felt it was earned in the book, it's hard. I think it's much harder to represent tenderness, care, kindness, and love and pleasure than it is to represent pain, betrayal in fiction. And so I just wanted to ask you about your sort of thinking on representations of care and violence and that kind of balance that you struck in this novel. I know so much of it is instinctive, but when you're writing, is that something that you're thinking about?
I think it definitely is. Like, there's a kind of internal feeling of balance when I'm writing. It's like it exists on the line level and it exists on the sort of on the texture and the tone level of a novel. So like, even for example, just on a line level, I remember being taught in the MFA, and I thought it was such a brilliant little like hack almost, that if you write a really long, fluid sentence, just punctuate it with a short sentence afterwards. It just shows that you're in control of the prose and you understand the kind of rhythms of a reader. And I think there's something that's happening tonally when I write as well that's the same thing, where like, there are books like, I loved A Little Life, you know, so like there are books that can be just pretty brutal from start to finish, and like, and you can still enjoy them, but I think my own nature is more buoyant naturally. And so I like to write about kind of heavy topics. Like, it's not even I like to, I can't avoid it. So like addiction, chronic pain, as you said, there are moments of sexual vulnerability in this book because these are young women. And I don't want to steer away from them because it's honest and it's the truth. And yet at the same time, I guess there's this inclination towards just seeing the kind of the grace that exists around these sisters all the time. And the big central question of the novel is, how do you fall back in love with life when the thing that you're afraid of happening has happened in the wake of tremendous loss and grief? And I guess I had to ask that of myself too, like, how do we survive as a population the fact that we all die, you know, and that death is part of our life, and that the people we love will inevitably die, and there will be natural death like grandparents and pets, which of course are still really sad, and there'll also be tragic death like children and siblings, where it goes against the natural order of life. And that, I think, is very hard to recover from when the sort of the rhythm of life that's been established gets upset and upturned. And so for these sisters, it's exactly what you said actually about life affirmation. What I ultimately wanted them to explore is the realization that comes in the wake of death that they are alive, that they still have their life, then they must live it in whatever form they can. And when we open the novel, I would say that all of them on some level are trying to die in a way. Bonnie is picking these violent fights. Avery she's 10 years sober and maybe on the cusp of a relapse. She's smoking, she's stealing, she's lying, she's cheating. Lucky is using drugs and drinking to this degree that is so self-annihilating. And somehow over the course of the book, and I think for them it was by coming back together with each other, they find a way to see that it is a gift that they're here, and that the world around them still has so much to offer them in these unexpected ways. And like that, no one's ever mentioned that moment when Lucky falls asleep on the bus because she's actually kind of drunk. And it's a tiny moment, it's an older woman dressed in lilac that's watching her. And these ways that there is still like love existing all around them. And I think grief for me is such a fascinating emotion to write about. It's such an umbrella emotion, because within grief is anger, there's relief sometimes if someone's been suffering, there's joy, there's melancholy, there's ennui, there's hope, there's so much that exists inside, there's humor, there's laughter. And so it's such a kaleidoscopic emotion, and I wanted to try to do justice to it and not paint it in just sort of one grey hue. So although they are grieving, that grief actually makes them very alive to what's happening around them. I tried to write a book that felt very vivid. Like, I thought a lot about the colors around them, they're these very different cities at first. And I really tried to capture like what London feels like, New York feels like, LA feels like, Paris feels like. They're like these super saturated postcards almost. And it's fun to write that way. I'm not the most like subtle writer. Like, I like to write extra, you know, like if I'm going to write about characters, I want them to be like messy characters, you know, and if I'm going to write about a city, I want it to be like the most city-ish city ever. And with these characters, like if they were going to F up, I wanted them to really do it. And if they were going to recover, I wanted them to really recover, you know, and there was something, it certainly makes the writing experience for me extremely pleasurable, and I hope it's pleasurable to read as a result.
It is. That reminded me of the way that you represent cities in this book. There's Paris, one of the sisters is living in Paris when we meet her. There's London, which a good portion, there's a good portion of the book takes place in London. And there's also, a lot of the book obviously happens in New York and then some in LA. So you've chosen these global cities. You've rendered all of them with extreme specificity. I know you've spent time in all of these cities, but what maybe impressed me most was that you wrote them from an American perspective. And you are not American, but you've spent a lot of time here. I was just wondering about your approach to inhabiting. All of the sisters were born in America, and it felt so lived in and so true to me. These, of course, they always joke like, "We're from New York. We're not really American."
Yeah.
But it just felt that was one of the things that felt so inhabited. And I was wondering if you could talk about that, like inhabiting an American perspective.
Yeah, I've actually never really talked about that. I moved to America when I was 15, so I had kind of an unusual entry point here. It's sort of an odd age to move. You know, I did my last 3 years of high school in New York, and it's such a vibrant time in one's life, I would say, like that period of kind of mid-adolescence. You know, I'd had my first boyfriend, and I had my group of friends, and like I was obsessed with the Strokes and these bands, you know, and it was like a real time of like fandom in my life, like where I was really looking. There's something about teenage girls, like I write in the book about the girls going to a Spice Girls concert when they were like young girls and teenagers, and just the like, the powerful pleasure of being in a space, and obviously we see it with Taylor Swift and Charlie XCX, of like being in this space with like like-minded women where you're made to feel that being a girl is so fucking good. Oh God, sorry God, but but it's just like, it's not this like weakness, you know, it's not this bad, it's just like, it just feels tremendous. And so when I moved to New York, I guess my own relationship with the city was a kind of teenage romance. You know, I was so aware of the city, and there's nothing like moving at any age when we're adults, when I go to college, like when you are set in a new situation or setting, you're so engaged, you know, you're noticing everything because you don't know anything yet. And so I would say, probably because I lived the whole second half of my life in America, I feel like I understand America probably better than I understand England, because I was paying attention to my surroundings here in a way that there was so much in my English life that was just assumed and kind of invisible to me, because it just felt like, oh, that's my childhood, that's how everything's done. And so, but there's something about that perspective of being in proximity to, but not part of, close to a culture, but not quite feeling one with the culture, that I think is a very natural place for a writer, because it's an act of witnessing. But it's always interesting for me to write from that perspective. So I like having characters that are a little bit taken out of their natural setting, but because there is that level of engagement that they have to notice. And as the writer, you should be noticing all the time. Like Avery's living in London, and she's walking along, you know, after an AA meeting with a fellow, and she's noticing how the evenings in London are so long, like the sun just doesn't set, and she thinks it's like a note in a song that's just held on and on and on. Whereas the nights in New York they'd be these boiling hot summer nights where they'd go into like pitch darkness so quickly, and like that's the kind of state that's nice to be in as a writer. It's the only, we used to talk about this in the MFA, I think, only in fiction can you slow down time. There's something, films can't do it. I mean, like, you can kind of do a slow motion montage, but that act, you could have 100 years pass in a sentence, and you can have one day last an entire book, like in Ulysses. And there's something really pleasurable, I think, about when you have characters in their not natural environment, that it slows things down, and there has to be this act of noticing, and it's just, and then when you put them back in sort of where they're from, which is what happens in New York, the pace immediately picks back up, because they're in their setting, they're not doing that work anymore, and they're just, life is sort of rushing them forward. And so for me, this novel kind of starts a bit slower, and then hopefully it's like getting on a treadmill, so you're just whooshed off into the sort of future. And then the final moment of the novel is slow again, another act of observation from the perspective of the newest kind of person on earth, it's a new baby.
Which brings me to a question. I mean, the last acknowledgement that you made in this book was to your baby, who was not yet born, but now he is, Indigo. And there's so much in this book about nurturing and care, the question of motherhood, to be a mother, to not be a mother, their own mother. There's a great fight between, just amazing fight scene in this book between two of the sisters. And it's the youngest and the oldest, which is really interesting. And the youngest is, both of them, they're very similar. They both have suffered from addiction. One is recovered, one is in recovery, one is very much not. And at one point, the younger sister says something about their useless mother, and the oldest sister says, she's my useless mother too.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of description about the kind of pressures of mothering on the oldest sister. She took up the mantle because the parents in this book were not able to care for their children. You became a mother as you, actually after you published this book, after you'd written a full draft of it. But I was wondering how becoming a mother has changed your relationship to writing in general and then to this book in particular.
Yeah, I mean, my son is 9 months old now, Indigo, the most beautiful baby that ever lived. When I wrote those acknowledgements, I think I was 6 months pregnant, and I could never have known that I would end up having really severe preeclampsia, and I gave birth like a month later, and my son was in the NICU for 2 months. So I had no idea what was coming, but I wrote this novel for 2 years, sort of separate from the question of motherhood. But for Avery, the eldest sister, it's a big question in her storyline, which is whether or not to become a mother when she feels like she's already been so parentified for her whole life. And then the mother character in the book was very absent for most of the story, and that's one of the issues for the sisters, is that they didn't really have the steady presence of a loving mother, and that's so much of what they're kind of scrambling to make up for with each other. It was really important to me that there was a scene where the mother got to speak for herself. Mm-hmm. And as with all of these characters, like, I don't believe in writing characters as they ought to be. I'm not interested in moralizing. I'm interested in showing people how they are, but always, I feel, with a very compassionate lens. So this mother is in many ways, she's so not the ideal mother. But then when we get to hear from her perspective, it's complicated again by the reality of her situation, having 4 young children at a time where, you know, postpartum, when women's health was not really understood. And she has this amazing moment where she says to Avery, who is blaming herself for the death of her sister, she says, "Oh, you think it's your fault?" And she grabs her and hugs her, and she never really touches her daughter, and she says, "You're not that important." And it's this loving statement delivered in this quite cruel way, and that is their mother, you know? Like, she can only really, she just is armored, and she can't seem to let that down. But beneath the armor, there is this like very tender beating heart. And then there were 2 things actually. I wanted to have a child, and the last year of working on this book, I was in the process of trying, and I had a miscarriage that just devastated me. You know, I was so sad. I remember saying to my husband, like, even when I'm happy, I'm sad. Like, will I ever just feel happy again? And that's exactly what the sisters are experiencing in this book. And then the next week afterwards, I sold Blue Sisters. And I had this experience of selling Cleopatra and Frankenstein where I could not give that book away. You know, it famously got rejected by every publisher, and it eventually was taken by Bloomsbury, and it was beautiful.
Big mistake, huge.
Exactly. Just like that moment in Pretty Woman. You work on commission, right? Which they do, publishers. But when Blue Sisters went out, it had a really different experience, and lots of publishers wanted it, which was like amazing and so great. So I had this like real high moment in my career directly off the back of a really low moment in my personal life. And then I was given this opportunity to do this edit with my editors, and I changed so much of the book. And that's something about being in that state of grief myself, something I hadn't expected that came out of it. You used the word tenderness, was that I felt this tremendous sense of tenderness to myself and to the people in the world around me. Like, I suddenly felt like I had crossed into the shadowland where I finally understood that everyone would lose someone and that everyone would experience grief. And I had been in the light for so long, I hadn't known, but I was in it. And at the time I lived in LA, and I remember walking around and like, I just kept thinking like, I'm alive. Like somebody conceived me and my mother, my wonderful mother, and birthed me, and I am the result of this miracle that I am trying to do myself. And every single person I'm seeing is the result. Like every single person was conceived and born. It was like, I mean, it seemed obvious, but it was blowing my mind. Like, and then I got pregnant again, and I had the chance to do, I was in the very final stage of editing where you're only just meant to do like almost like tiny little like grammar edits. And I had the ending of the book, which ended with Avery, and I liked the ending a lot, but it had always slightly felt not right to me because I wanted to end, I opened with all the sisters in the prologue, and I wanted to end with all the sisters. And I thought about ending with a memory of the four of them, but it just didn't feel honest because the truth is, like, they're not four anymore, they're three, you know, and they just had to find a way to live as three. And then the edit was due in just a few days, and I went for a run, and I had a vision of the epilogue, and I saw what turned out that is the ending of the book for those who have read it, and it just felt like, it felt so hopeful, and it felt so beautiful. And I felt like I was in such a place of longing in my own life, and I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know if I'd stay pregnant, and I did, and that's my son now. But I felt like I want to give my characters something that will last. I want to give them what I want. And it felt so right. And I didn't know if my editors would like it or if the readers would like it, but I'm so happy to hear, because it's been read by quite a lot of people all over the world now, because it came out a bit earlier in the UK, and like lots of people seem to cry, and often in public, they're like not expecting it, and I love a good public cry with a book. Like, I just think it's the most delicious feeling. So it just goes to show that so much of writing fiction is, I never really write autobiography, like that's not been, but emotional biography seeps into everything I do, and I have to stay open to the experience of being alive with all its pain and with all its sort of gorgeous life-affirming hope, and that ends up in the book itself.
Such a beautiful answer, and that I can't believe that was added at the very end of the editing process, because it feels so harmonious with the book, and it's so beautiful. I'm so happy that you were able to make that the ending. I think that we have, unfortunately, we have maybe time for one more question, or should we? Okay, one more question, then we go to the audience. We can't talk about this book without talking about addiction and sobriety and recovery. And in a kind of larger sense, this is more related to the theme of pain, as you were saying, like being alive to the pain, the fullness of experience. It seems like every sister is trying to escape the fullness of experience in some way or another. And even for Bonnie, the healthiest one, she talks about her devotion to pain as a boxer. And Chidi or Chitty?
Either. Chitty.
The wife of Bonnie of Avery is also one of the healthier characters, a very healthy character, a lovely character in this book. But even she, her moment of devotion to Avery is like painful for her at some point. Like, I wish I didn't love you unconditionally, but I do. And so I just wanted to ask you about your decision to include not just these really rapturous, beautifully described, very vivid descriptions of inebriation and self-destruction, but also of the difficulties of recovery. We have a character in recovery who it seems like the book is interested in the fact that this isn't just like the promised land. It's not like everything is resolved. She is still struggling in lots of ways. And it just seemed like that was an important aspect of the book, to depict the challenges of recovery.
I think there's always a feeling as a writer that you're looking for the depictions of experiences you've had or know about that feel honest and true. And I just hadn't seen a ton, I felt, in either books or in TV and film about long-term sobriety. I felt like there was a lot about people who getting sober, you know, and the kind of addiction narrative focuses a lot on the experience of active addiction, and then maybe like the very earliest phase of recovery or rehab. And I made the decision early in my career to be open about the fact that I am sober, and I'm phenomenally proud to be sober. And I'm now between 8 and 9 years sober. So part of my life is learning how to do this thing not for a week, you know, but for long term, which means experiencing life as it comes without numbing myself in any way. And for these characters, that is a real struggle because they're in tremendous psychic pain when the novel opens, and they're trying to get out of it. You know, they're just trying to do anything they can to not feel this grief that is sort of overwhelming them. But by cutting themselves off, like, if you cut yourself off from the good stuff, I mean the bad stuff, you cut yourself off from the good stuff too, and that's what they ultimately kind of have to come to terms with. It's like, they have to feel the kind of enormity of this loss, and in doing so, they also become aware of the enormity of the gain, which is that they have each other still. And so Avery at one point, who is 10 years sober in the book, says, you know, I think I know what makes me an addict, and it's that I find what gives me pleasure and I do it until it gives me pain. And there's just a certain type of person in life who's like that, and they're, you know, I'm married to someone who's not at all like that. Like, my husband has like never smoked a cigarette. He doesn't seem to like things that are bad for him, and I don't get it. Like, but I'm in awe of it, and I love living with someone like that. But like, for me, part of the pleasure is that there's some pain in it, you know, doing things that are a bit like naughty or that you sort of know are self-destructive. Like, at one point, Avery also thinks like, wow, smoking is like the best form of meditation. Like, if only it wasn't killing me, you know? And so I wanted to explore that. And I guess I just wanted to explore like narratives of recovery and addiction that just felt a bit more rounded and robust, like that didn't glorify it, didn't demonize it, were kind of frank about it. Like, I would probably hazard a guess that every single person in this room has known someone who's dealt with addiction in some form, has loved someone or hated someone or dealt with it in their own life. Like, I think it is phenomenally common. It is steeped in shame. It is so lonely to be in it. And yet, I guess when I write about it, I feel so free because I feel like it's the thing that I think being able to write honestly about the things that make us feel the most alone is what makes fiction so powerful. So it was fun to write. It was fun to write Avery, who's kind of having a bit of a, as the British would say, a nervy bee at this point in her life. And then it was fun to write Lucky, who like is really, you know, in such a bad place in the beginning, and does find recovery and is kind of cynical about it and wary of it. And it's just nice to write about it from different perspectives. And like, there's no one face of addiction. There's no one face of it in a family. So just to offer that kind of multiplicity within one story was gratifying. And I think it's a topic, to be honest, that I find myself returning to again and again because I feel like I live inside of it. And I think any of these things, it's not really that I'm trying to destigmatize it, it's just that it's part of life, and I want to embrace that it's part of life as opposed to pretend that it's not, you know?
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think we're going to go to audience questions, so maybe I'll pass my mic and we can give a round of applause and go to audience.
I knew each sister and that I loved them as though they were real people. And I guess my question to you is, in the hands of a lesser writer, I can imagine that like writing four sisters, like two of them could be like jumbled up, like really similar. So how do you go about, you know, developing these four sisters from like just the concept to like real people?
That's a great question, and thank you for asking the first question. That's a very particular type of person, a brave soul, and I commend you, so thank you. In the book, actually, it says that Nikki always asks the first question in a Q&A because she's so empathetic, and she's like, I don't want the person to be waiting. So I think that's, when I was writing these sisters, I almost had like a kind of visual idea in my mind, like I was almost thinking like Powerpuff Girls, like Spice Girls, you know, like really distinct individuals that make up a unit that is greater than the sum of the parts. And there was a kind of useful, just a simple hack, which was to give them each their own city at the opening of the novel and give them each a very distinct career. So Avery is the lawyer in London, Bonnie is the boxer in LA, Nikki is the school teacher in New York, and Lucky is the model in Paris. And then thinking how those very different careers would attract and shape very different natures. So, and then thinking of birth order was interesting to me, and how the sisters would and would not adhere to the expectations of their birth order. So the kind of, I'm always thinking of like, what would be expected, and then how can I upturn that in some way? So like Avery, the eldest, type A, successful lawyer, looks after everyone. What does it look like when she stops playing that role? You know, Bonnie, the diplomat, the peacekeeper, what does it look like when she steps away from that and thinks like, how could I be free of this? And then Nikki, you know, the open book, really maternal, seemingly very straightforward when we find out she's been keeping a pretty big secret. And then Lucky, this like spiky, rebellious youngest who seems so independent. What does it look like for her to really need to rely on someone else at one point? So in that sense, they all felt very distinct because they had very distinct needs and very distinct desires. And then like writing the prologue, which I didn't read the whole thing from, but like it was such a fun writing exercise, which was like, how do I think of these really like just like specific and kind of graphic details that sum up who they are? So like there's like Bonnie can like get ice out of the tray without like bashing it on the counter. Like that's part of her kind of like physical agility and also her gentleness. And so like just always thinking of those little moments that capture them. And I guess they never felt similar to me. Like I always felt them as real people are, as very, very different. So, it was useful to underscore that difference by having their settings, careers, even like they wear different colors. I had different music I listened to for each of them. Like I really did consciously try to make sure that they kind of had their lane. And then almost like a braid, when they start to weave together, that's when they become stronger, you know. So that was fun to write as well. Like I wrote them all so separate, and then they all returned to New York halfway through the book, and I was like, oh, what are they like when they interact with each other? And they're pretty different. And that's the other thing I love actually, is just like thinking about family. Like one of the reasons I think family is so comforting is because we have our set role in a family, and it can be lovely to return to it. And one of the reasons I think family is such a nightmare bed of trauma is that we have our set roles in our family, and when we return to it, they often don't fit. So like, I'm the baby of my family, which I think kind of means that like sort of within the family I'm seen as like sort of like useless, you know, like I can't do things.
Clown.
Like, yes, exactly. It's like little baby cloud. But outside of my family, I would be considered quite competent. And they're like the tension between returning home and on the one hand like loving being the baby again, and on the other hand being like, no one else sees me this way. I'm like, Mom, like my friends think I'm really mature, you know, like that was interesting to look at as well. So it's like they have their identities, they have their roles, and then what does it look like to take it away from them? Thank you for asking that. Hi.
I remember at the Q&A you had your Motherhood time, you talked about how like your writing process for that book was like you go to the library and like turn your Wi-Fi off and just like have to sit and focus. And I was wondering if you had like a different writing process for this one, since you already have like one novel under your belt, and like what the timeline was between the two books. But I listened to like a podcast interview that you had recently about how you go on these like imagination walks and
Yes.
sort of like let your mind wander, and like how that comes into your process.
Yes. Oh, thanks for letting me talk about imagination walks, which like is like the hill I'll die on. I'm such a believer in them. Yeah, for Cleopatra and Frankenstein, it took 5 years to write that book. And I would go to the library, and I actually just never got the password for their Wi-Fi, which is a great hack, to be honest, just never get it. And I would put my phone in a locker. And then Blue Sisters, in some ways was easier, in some ways harder. It took 3 years to write, I think 3.5 years, which I thought was like Speedy Gonzalez, to be honest. I moved to LA, and I started it in the beginning of 2020, and the pandemic happened about a month later. So we were all experiencing a time of like limited distraction in some ways. And then another way, I think we were all in the kind of cockpit of our phones and computers, and I got more distractions in this kind of like, my whole life seemed to move online. The things, it's like, I always want to be mindful. Like, I used to go to these readings with authors, and I would always leave feeling terrible when they would describe their process, because they would be like, well, I wake up at 5 and I write for 3 hours until 8, and then I make a cup of coffee, and then I edit for 2, and I would be like, oh my God, like I've never had that kind of discipline. I have never had a writing process that sounds good, you know? But what I'm interested in is not so much like the daily structure, is how to create momentum that keeps moving forward over long periods of time. And the way that I've done that is by genuinely trying to make it enjoyable and maintaining an element of playfulness. So, and then counterbalance always with a certain level of discipline, because it is hard now. Like, it's hard with our phones, it's hard with our computers. Like, and my teacher, Nathan Englander, always used to say it's the 27th second that's the moment of genius, but you have to sit through 1 through 26 of not knowing what's going to happen. And now, because all of our, I think, focus and attention span is going down, it's so easy to tap out at like 15, and then you go back to 0. So in order to help myself get to 27, which is an imaginary number, but I try to write in 3-hour chunks with no Wi-Fi and my phone truly like locked away somewhere else. Almost like a marathon runner at the moment. I'm having to work my way back up to that because I haven't done it in a while and my focus is just not there. So you don't have to start with 3 hours, like start with 30 minutes, where you just have no distractions. When I'm really stuck and it's just not coming, I'm a big believer in move a muscle, change a thought. I go for my imagination walks, no podcasts, no phone calls. You can listen to music, which I adore, and you just imagine, just give your mind the space to expand for a little bit of time. Like, so much of that imagination time has been eaten into, I feel, in my own life by like scrolling time. So just giving myself space where I can do that. And then the third thing that I actually need to recommit to for my third book is that I've always been in a writing group. Like Tess and I were in a writing group in LA when we were both working on our second novels. And just having that sense of community, having a deadline where I know I'm going to hand something in, having the like critique and feedback so that I can make edits, and having the praise and encouragement to keep going. It was so essential. Like, I'm not a big believer in this lone wolf writer trope, I'm like, we're pack animals, humans, we need each other to survive. And I believe that the creative process is fed by other people around me as opposed to sort of subtracted by them. So those are my little tips for writing. You're welcome.
Hearing you talk about your characters today just reminded me about how my favorite thing about both of your books is how connected you are with them. So I want to know, how do you usually sit with them before you actually put them to life on paper?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It's been different for each book. Like, Blue Sisters I started thinking about when I was still working on Cleopatra and Frankenstein, but it was very inchoate, but I just started having this feeling of like, I want to write about sisters. Like, one of my best friends who's here tonight, Zoe, is one of 4 sisters, and I had always thought it was so, she's raised her hand. I always thought it was so magic to be one of 4, so I had just started thinking about that like probably a year before I started writing. And I do believe, it's like, as with everything, it's so hard to know the balance. Like, I believe that the time of gestation and imagination is so important, and then it's also easy to procrastinate. And so it's hard to know sometimes which is which. But I do think, in general, I would say with fiction, that it's okay for things to take longer than you expect. Because the book, ideally, you're writing something that's going to live after you die. Like, I'd like to have readers that are not yet born, in a cosmic, beautiful world. So if something takes a few years, that's fine, if it takes multiple years longer than expected. The book I'm working on at the moment, I had the idea for 2 years ago, and it's really been living inside of me. And sometimes I felt like, oh God, I should have just got it out. But I also know that the unconscious is working all the time and kind of muddling through things. And that is work that can't be rushed. And I think actually Ocean Vuong, the poet and writer, talks so beautifully about this. He describes it as the yin yang of writing. And the yin is when you cast your nets upon the water, waiting for the bounty of the fish to come in. It's a quiet and peaceful time, and it doesn't look like much. And in our society, where we're so hyper-productive, even the term workshop is an industrial term that we apply to creative work. It can be hard to stay in that place because it feels like it's not anything, but it is a lot. And the difference between the net on the water and spearfishing, where you're only catching one fish at a time, but you're in this frenzied action, is huge. And yet somehow the spearfishing feels more productive, but it's not. And then the yang is that when you like bring in the nets and they're full is when you like prepare the fish for market. And that is the process of writing. And Ocean would do this work with his students in poetry where he would ask them to write poems only in their mind, and they'd have nothing to show for it except for the experience of thinking about language. And I found that really permissive, actually, and it made me feel a lot better. So if anyone is working on a book and it's taking longer than you want and you feel like you're not doing enough, like, just tell yourself, like, I'm in yin, like, the nets are on the water. And I think that allowed me to feel better about how slow my process can sometimes be. Thanks for that question, and thanks for wearing blue.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm curious how you named these sisters. I loved hearing authors talk about how they come to names and maybe names you discarded and why.
Yes, that's a great question. Sometimes it's just very intuitive, like it's just a name that just seems, I just have it. I tried, because I wanted to have a child, I was really trying not to give them any names I might have wanted for my own daughter. So I was trying to pick names I liked, but not too much. And then the names ended up having, I felt they were right, like Avery, there's a lot of bird imagery that surrounds her, and so much of her storyline is about like sort of trying to take flight. So that felt like a really right name for her. Bonnie I loved as a name because it's an old-fashioned, very feminine name, and it's very sweet, you know, like Bonnie baby. And yet Bonnie herself is this kind of, could literally kill you with a single punch. So sometimes it's fun to have a name that casts, that is to directly contrast the nature of the character. Nikki or Nicole for me was like, I don't know why I think this is such an American name, but I was thinking of like Brittany, Kirsty, like these American girl names that, like, you know, growing up in England, I always thought were like the height of like being just sort of like a girl, you know. So and then Nikki is the only name that doesn't, it ends with a Y when it's the nickname, but Nicole, the full version, sets her apart from the other sisters. So just even that feeling of her being different in some way. And then Lucky I liked because it's a name that just like, it's got charisma, you know, like it's a cheeky name, it's got a bit of a wink to it, and like, she is lucky, you know.
She's often described as a husky, like that's
Yes,
like a dog
she's like
name.
a husky.
That's like a, yeah.
And and then I ended up having these E names all through the book. There's Peachy and Chitty and, you know, Troll Doll, I guess, is not one of them. But there was something about the names chiming that created a kind of harmony inside of the story. Always like to pick names. I have known Coco is the somewhat original name, so I like to give names that feel somewhat different but still realistic, you know? So that's a great question, though. Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
So I was wondering, you mentioned that the lone wolf trope of like writers, and another trope is, I think, often like associating alcohol and writing
Yes.
the right drum and the silver. And I'm wondering if you know, how your writing process changed through your sobriety.
Yeah, that's such a great question. I mean, I think like when I was kind of growing up, yeah, definitely the writers that I was taught in school and often looked to, like Faulkner, Cheever, Hemingway, Vonnegut, Hunter S. Thompson, all white men, half of whom killed themselves. So like clearly it didn't totally work out for them, you know, but there was this real sort of lore around like the alcoholic writer, like the hard living writer. And I think I definitely subscribed to it as a younger person of thinking that like, to be creative was to suffer, you know, and that it meant a certain amount of pain and self-inflicted pain to get the work done. And and then luckily when I did my MFA, the teachers I had, like Martin Amis and Zadie Smith, they really seemed to have these like tremendously like happy family lives and kind of like normal lives, but with this great joy of creation at the center of it. You know, Martin Amis used to say it's Promethean, it's like stealing fire from the gods. Martin Amis actually, I feel like he was having a good time as well. Maybe he was on the list of those other writers, but I just managed to luckily find, especially female authors actually, who were different examples to me of what a writer could be. And then in my own life, I was never going to finish a book if I kept doing what I was doing in my 20s. I'm in awe of those that do, but I truly believe from my own experience that they managed to get that work done in spite of their drinking and alcoholism, not because of it. Because I know that not only did I get a lot of time back when I got sober a year into writing Cleopatra and Frankenstein, like not being hungover was a huge gift, you know, just to be able to wake up on a Sunday and go to the library and write for 3 hours and then go meet a friend. And then the second, probably even deeper thing that happened is that I stayed present with myself, and I started to understand myself better through all the discomfort. And that's, I feel like, what gave me insight into character. And I don't know how I would write characters if I wasn't able to do that with myself, you know. And if every time I was in pain or uncomfortable or feeling shy, I found a way to tap out, I just feel like I wouldn't be able to write deep, rich, complicated people, which is what I want to do. So it's partly why I chose to be open about being sober, because I not to be on like a soapbox at all, not everyone needs to be, but for those who perhaps are struggling, many of whom are creative and do want to make art, I'd love to be an example of someone who has done this and not needed to hurt myself to do it, you know. It's a really nice life being a writer, and it's really nice to be awake and not hungover for most of it. So thanks for asking that. And if you have any other questions, you can always ask them to me in the signing line, one-on-one.
All right, well, thank you all so much for being here. Thank you to Tess and Coco. If you are on the live stream, you can buy a copy in the link in your description. And everyone else, if you haven't bought a copy, if you have them out there, and Coco is going to personalize. All of your copies are signed. If you'd like it personalized, we will have a table right here, and we're going to start the line right at that pillar. And thank you so much.
Thank you, Daddy.
Of course. Would you like this?
Really was. God, you've become so fluent.
It's gotten lost.
I think those handy tips must be fantastic to these.
Yes. Oh, thanks.
Hello, New York Times bestselling author.
Yes. Oh, yeah, we didn't even get to say it at the talk.
We all know.
Yes, exactly. We live it.
Yes, we do.
Well done.
Oh,
Nice to see you.
oh, it's so nice to see you. And you're getting a copy for Bev. She told me that you were going to get her one.
Yes, I think Dad's got one.
Hi.
Bill.
Hi, so nice to meet you.
Yeah, then we actually met with Lisa Dwan at NYU
Oh,
years
yeah,
ago.
I didn't
Yes.
know.
And
Oh, it's so nice. I just saw
you were
Lisa this summer.
a baby then. So great to see you now.
I'm Donna.
Oh, hi,
We
Donna.
were on a meeting once with your You're just fabulous. And smoking.
Man, like bragging about baby and baby's like indigo, and then indigo babe, and they're talking about eating but he's like random. And then Henry shows up and he said to me, he's like, this is Coco's father. This makes a lot more sense. I was like, I don't know these people. And they're talking about baby Indy.
Oh, it's so nice to see you. Thank you for coming.
Is the tour over?